Colleagues, we are reminded that it's a hard stop at 8:30, so I will begin since we do have quorum. Mr. Arsenault, oui? Yes. We'll begin at this time.
Yep,
Yes.
all right.
Okay,
Go ahead,
wonderful. So good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I'd like to begin by welcoming the members of the committee, the witnesses, as well as those watching this meeting online. My name is Jana Martin, and I'm the Senate Joint co-chair of the committee, and I'm joined by Honorable Mark Garneau, the House of Commons Joint Chair. And today we are continuing our examination of the statutory review of the provisions of the Criminal Code relating to medical assistance in dying and their application. I'd like to remind members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted unless recognized by name by one of the joint chairs. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. An interpretation in this video conference will work like an in-person committee meeting. You'll have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. So again, I'd like to welcome our witnesses for panel 1 who are here to discuss MAID when a mental disorder is the sole underlying medical condition. So we have 3 panelists. As individuals, Dr. Marie Nicolini by video conference, Shakir Rahim, lawyer of Kastner Lamb LLP by video conference, and Dr. Michael True, clinical associate professor at the University of Calgary, also by video conference. So thank you for joining us to all 3 of you, and we'll begin with remarks by Dr. Nicolini, followed by Mr. Rahim, and then Dr. True. So each of you will have 5 minutes, which I will be timing. So Dr. Nicolini, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, I'm Dr. Marie Nicolini, and I'm pleased to be here today talking to the committee. I'm a medical doctor and a psychiatrist with a PhD in bioethics. I was trained in Belgium, where the practice of MAID for mental disorders has been permitted for 20 years. Over the last 5 years, I've published a wide range of groundbreaking research on MAID for mental disorders, published in top journals in ethics and psychiatry. I've performed this research at leading bioethics institutions around the world, including the National Institutes of Health and the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. And I've delivered invited lectures on this topic at top universities, medical centers, and conferences around the world, like King's College London, University of Pennsylvania, the American Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Conference. My research has established foundational facts about how the practice of MAID for mental disorders is actually carried out, based on large sets of data on actual cases of MAID in the Netherlands. In addition, my research has also clarified the ethical questions raised by the practice, particularly with regard to women. I've made it a point to pursue this research from a neutral perspective that sets out to examine how eligibility requirements actually apply, what the standards are for those requirements, and what difficulties they raise. My research has not taken a position for or against the practice of MAID. Based on these extensive and highly detailed investigations, I have discovered 2 central challenges for the practice of MAID for mental disorders. I'll state these 2 and then explain each one in a bit more detail. First, incurability or irremediability is always a core requirement for MAID, but we do not have a coherent account of what it means for a mental disorder to be incurable. Second, countries that have MAID continue to pursue suicide prevention programs, but at this time, there is no principle to guide clinicians in determining whether MAID or suicide prevention is warranted in any given case. On the first concern, with MAID for cases of physical disease, there is always a requirement that the condition must be incurable or irremediable. In cases for MAID for mental disorder, that requirement carries over, but we do not have an understanding of what it amounts to for a medical disorder to be incurable. We can take an objective approach that lists all of the available evidence-based treatments and their likely prognosis, but my research shows that prognosis cannot be predicted in psychiatry. Alternatively, we could take a subjective approach, as Canada has, where patients themselves determine whether their mental disorders can be remedied. But this does not allow us to filter out cases where MAID has actually been requested on the basis of social conditions, social maladies like poverty, unemployment, gender-based violence, or other inequities. On the second concern, because countries that have MAID for mental disorder do continue to pursue suicide prevention programs, it is of the utmost importance to establish clear parameters for deciding when we should assist with a wish for death and when we should take steps to prevent it. At this time, there is no practical or conceptual guidance that characterizes the difference between these two kinds of situations. These two problems pose a serious ethical liability for any government that chooses to legalize the practice of MAID for mental disorder. If we don't have clear standards for what is curable and what is not, and for the difference between MAID and suicide prevention, clinicians must proceed on a case-by-case basis in their evaluations around this ultimate decision. The problem with a case-by-case approach is that decision-making is then based on clinicians' personal intuitions and unrecognized biases. My research has shown that patients with mental illness who also have physical disabilities are more likely to be referred to the end-of-life clinic in the Netherlands, now called the Expertise Center Euthanasia. Paradoxically, persons who also had physical disabilities were less likely to be seen by a psychiatrist before death was carried out. I think we can all agree that this is an outcome and a liability that Canada should set out to avoid. Therefore, based on my research, it is highly problematic to allow MAID for mental disorders before we clarify first what it means for a mental disorder to be incurable, and second, what it is that distinguishes a case of MAID from a case of suicide prevention. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Golini. And next we will have Mr. Shakir Rahim. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. By way of introduction, I'm a lawyer with a practice that includes human rights cases of provincial and national significance, including those that concern Section 15, the equality provision of the Charter. I was intervenor co-counsel in the case of Ontario NG, a 2020 Supreme Court decision that applied Section 15 in relation to mental disorder. I'm here today to offer my legal perspective, but I also note that I am a person who has lived with a mental illness for 18 years. I will first explain how Section 15 relates to MAID MD SUMC. And second, I will discuss my view that the expert panel's recommendations comply with the spirit and letter of Section 15 of the Charter. Section 15.1 confers the right to equal protection and benefit of the law. If a law makes a distinction in a discriminatory manner between persons on enumerated or analogous grounds, that is a Section 15.1 violation. Mental disability is an enumerated ground. A distinction is discriminatory if it imposes a burden or denies a benefit in a way that reinforces, perpetuates, or exacerbates disadvantage. In the case law, the factors relevant to this determination are myriad and can include psychological or physical harm. If Parliament passed legislation that created a separate MAID regime for those with a mental disorder, and MAID was more difficult to access under that regime, that could violate Section 15.1. This is because the regime would impose a burden on persons who seek to access MAID under the protected ground of mental disability. However, Section 1 of the Charter permits a violation of Section 15.1 if the state can establish it is a reasonable limit that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This is assessed by the Oakes test. The state must have a compelling and substantial objective for the rights infringement, and the means chosen must possibly further that objective, interfere with the charter right as little as reasonably possible, and the benefits of the infringement must outweigh its negative effects. In my view, the recommendation of the expert panel on MAID MD SUMC conforms to the spirit and letter of the Section 15 jurisprudence. I will highlight 3 reasons why. First, the expert panel rejects the stereotype that those with mental disorders are the only group affected by concerns like incapacity, suicidality, or the impact of structural vulnerabilities. The expert panel recommends that its safeguards, protocols, and guidance apply to all clinical situations in which these and related concerns arise. The Supreme Court, in the case of G, emphasized how those with mental disorders lose their rights and freedoms, specifically because of stereotyping about their propensities and capabilities. The expert panel's recommendation for a universally applicable approach precludes the application of that stereotype. Second, flowing from the expert panel's observation about the universality of these concerns, it does not recommend a separate regime under the criminal code for MAID MD-SUMC. This approach reduces the risk of a Section 15.1 violation because there is no formal distinction made under the law in relation to mental disorder. To be clear, a distinction can also exist through the uneven application of a facially neutral law. However, a formal distinction would explicitly entail differential treatment and increase the risk of a Section 15.1 violation. Third, the expert panel endorses individualized forms of assessment. The panel emphasizes that case-by-case evaluations by MAID assessors of incurability, irreversibility, and intolerability should be performed. This conforms to recent Section 15.1 jurisprudence, which has recognized an individualized assessment can be a less impairing alternative to a categorical form of treatment that is based on a prohibited ground of discrimination. That concludes my opening statement. Thank you.
And lastly, we'll have Dr. True. You have 5 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Just a few words about my relevant background. I'm a clinical psychiatrist for 40 years in Calgary with a special interest in the interplay between mental disorders and physical disorders. I am a clinical associate professor at the University of Calgary. I am the former chief medical officer of addiction and mental health at Alberta Health. I chaired the Alberta Health Services non-life limiting expert panel from 2016 to 18. I'm a member of the Canadian Psychiatric Association task group on MAID in mental disorders as the sole underlying medical condition. And I am also a member of the Canadian Association for MAID Assessors and Providers. And I have provided psychiatric assessment primarily as regards to capacity in community settings. In general terms, I respect and agree with the overall goals of Bills C-14 and C-7, along with the final report of the expert panel on MAID and mental illness. In my view, mental disorders have long been seen as separate and distinct from physical disorders. I believe that any ongoing distinction between mental disorders and physical disorders in MAID regulated legislation is unlikely to stand up to court review. From my own clinical experience, I can describe cases which most people would agree represent appropriate use of MAID for people who have a mental disorder as their sole underlying medical condition. I can also report cases which most people would be very uncomfortable if MAID for mental disorders was provided. The challenge is to identify a reliable assessment system to make these determinations. Failure to generate such a system invites risks, including substantial variability from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the risk of providing too much MAID for mental disorders or too little MAID for mental disorders, the attendant ethical distress for providers and survivors, and MAID shopping. In my view, the courts have judged on the most extreme cases with very strong and reasonable plaintiffs. These cases of extreme suffering and disability have established the principles which underlie MAID in general. Looking at them now, they seem relatively black and white. While some of the Track 2 cases, and I anticipate that many of the mental disorder as the sole underlying medical condition cases will be very nuanced and gray in their details. Not all of our requesters are or will be very reasonable. The level of complexity combined with the current practice, which has emphasized, for good reasons, the independence of assessments, calls for some consideration of the processes and the expectations going forward. The drive for MAID in the first place was largely driven by a person-centered, human rights-based approach. Bill C-14 largely focused on the question of not if a person was going to die soon, but how and when they would die soon. I believe that we have seen this taken up largely by individuals who are used to a high degree of personal control in their lives and choose to take this step at the time of their death. It has been very well received, and providers and survivors have attested to the relief and thanks which most would see as signs of success. The completion rate has been high in this group once the formal request was made. The anticipated situation for MAID with mental disorders being the sole underlying medical condition is very different. The Benelux experience reports a completion rate in the ranges of 0.5 to 4.5%, while our current overall Canadian completion rate in 2021 was reported to be 81%. This means an entirely different expectation set for assessors, as well as providers and those who request MAID for mental disorders. I anticipate this will be seen by some as being overly paternalistic. This may invite further court challenges unless the overlying administration is very carefully set and appropriate training is provided in concert across the country. I appreciate the wording of the expert panel in describing shared decision-making. I believe we also need to build on in the appropriate room for discussion between assessors after their first assessment in order to have the full opportunity to discuss these challenging cases. As noted above, while this is not explicitly banned in the legislation, the emphasis on independence of assessment leaves the impression that talking between assessors after their first meeting may not be acceptable. I also appreciate the expert panel's recommendation for involvement of treatment teams as part of this expanded process.
Sorry, Dr.
I would recommend.
Would you kindly wrap up? Would you wrap up shortly, please? Thank you.
Sure. I would recommend that there be agreement on a waiting period after an application has been declined in order to avoid doctor shopping.
Thank you very much.
Again,
thank you to our panelists, and we'll begin with our first round of questions led by Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I will direct my questions to Dr. Nicolini. We have heard from some witnesses that in the Netherlands, the number of cases that have been completed involving mental disorders are very small overall, amounting to 1.3% of cases. And it has been suggested that having regard for the experience in the Netherlands, that in expanding MAID in the Canadian context, the pool of persons who would seek to access this and would do so successfully would be a very small number of persons. Could you speak to some of the differences between the legal framework in Canada versus the Netherlands with respect to safeguards and specifically with respect to the irremediability requirement?
Thank you for your question. I'll briefly respond to the numbers. So it is correct. It is about 1 to 2%. It's been fluctuating both in the Netherlands, in Belgium, of MAID cases for mental disorder, 1 or 2% of the total number of cases of MAID. It is important to note that when we talk about MAID for cancer, for example, we're talking about 10% of cancer patients who request MAID. So we're talking about a substantial amount. As to the second part of your question, the differences between the Netherlands, the framework in the Netherlands and Canada, I will just say the main difference is the way irremediability, one of the key requirements, as I said, is being defined. The Netherlands adheres in their official guidelines to an objective account when they say that a clinician is supposed to assess a patient in light of their diagnosis and prognosis. My research has shown that we cannot predict prognosis in psychiatry, so on that account actually fails to function as a reliable account. Canada explicitly endorses a subjective account, and we have not started to determine what the standards would be for such subjective account when we talk about mental disorders.
So you would say that, would it be fair to say that it's not a fair comparison?
I think that's right. For that point, yes.
In your testimony, you talked a little bit about and you just raised it again, the issue of determining incurability, and in your testimony you expressed concern with or suggested it was problematic to assess cases on a case-by-case basis, as the expert panel recommended. The expert panel on the question of incurability spoke about determining it based upon treatment attempts made up to a point, outcomes of those treatments, and the severity and duration of the illness, disease, or disability. In other words, it's been said that, look, someone who is suffering from a sole mental illness, who hasn't gone through treatments, who just shows up and requests MAID, that these are not the type of patients that would successfully obtain a request. So can you speak to that recommendation of the expert panel and any concerns that you see from that standpoint?
Could you just briefly clarify the last
point?
I want to make sure you understand. Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to understand here your thoughts on essentially the recommendations of the expert panel, which are to say, yes, these cases can be decided on a case-by-case basis, having regard for the diverse number of factors that are unique to each individual patient, but that regard would have to be had for the number of treatments, the success or failure of those treatments before MAID could be carried out. In other words, this would not be happening overnight. This would be happening over a long period of time, a long period of assessment and treatments and so on.
Okay, very briefly, Dr. Nicolini.
Yes. So of course, we all agree that the evaluations themselves are done by clinicians very comprehensively and in good conscience. The point about there not being standards is important because if we do not have standards for what it means for a disease to be incurable, we cannot determine whether a patient meets that requirement.
Thank you, Dr. Nicolini. Next, we'll go to Mr. Maloney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for your presentations. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Nicolini. I arrived, I think, a moment or two after you started your presentation, so I heard something you said. I just want to clarify it as a starting point. You said later on that you cannot predict prognosis in a mental health context. Did I also hear you say that assessments would be based on personal opinions and intuitions of the physicians who are making the assessment?
I did say that that is a finding of my research based
Okay.
on the Dutch practice, yes.
Okay. So your view is that there are no circumstance with somebody who has mental illness where you can come up with a prognosis that the condition is permanent. Is that right?
That is right.
Okay.
Unlike, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. True, do you agree with that position?
I don't agree with that as a blanket condition, no.
Okay. And are you of the view that there are mental illness situations where a patient is experiencing severe mental illness where you can predict the prognosis?
Prediction is always a question of probability, and the psychiatry is the same as the rest of life. I think there are certainly cases where there's an extremely high rate of probability that this particular condition is not going to remediate. Part of the struggle for everyone is what has also been discussed is the question of, what about new kinds of things that are coming down the pipe, whether it's ketamine or certain kinds of brain stimulation or whatever. That is the case for anybody who comes up against to a MAID panel, and we can't. Honestly, the best predictor of the future is the past, and someone who has had many attempts at treatment that have gone across a wide range without response. I think there's a point where we would take that as being a reasonable conclusion.
Okay, thank you. So that leads me to my next question. I want to pick up on something that Mr. Cooper was just touching on. If I understood him correctly, he was suggesting that there might be a risk in a situation where a patient who is experiencing mental illness but had not undergone treatment could be in a situation where they would be allowed to access MAID. Is that a reasonable risk in your opinion, Dr. True?
I think the devil is always in the details, and in this case, it's the details of what the arrangements are for assessment. It shouldn't be the case that somebody who has not had reasonable trials can proceed with MAID, in my view, anyways. But there is this issue in the legislation that says that if it is not acceptable, the treatment is not acceptable to the patient, then you can't force them. I think there needs to be some clarification that there is a minimum amount of treatment before you proceed on to medically assisted death.
Okay, that's very fair and helpful, actually. But in your opinion, would somebody in your position, or Dr. Nicolini for that matter, what's the likelihood of a doctor making a determination that MAID was appropriate for somebody who refused treatment who had not ever received any treatment? I would think it's between 0 and unlikely somewhere.
Yeah, it was certainly unlikely. I think part of the difficulty is that historically, so much of the drive for medically assisted death has been based on the individual human rights. And again, we're moving from a group where everyone felt this was a reasonable thing to do, people who are likely to die soon, to a very different group where the probability of proceeding is actually low. And so doctors don't, like everyone else, don't like saying no.
Thank you, Doctor. That's all my time. I appreciate it.
We'll have Monsieur Thériault for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la coprésidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to ask Dr. Nicolini, and I think that you brought up a number of fundamental issues, but I had the impression that you nevertheless seem to agree with the expert panel's recommendations.
What I have stated is not a matter of personal opinion, they are my conclusions based on the extensive research that I have done. I have started researching this area when I was practicing in Belgium, and decided to pursue neutral research on this topic. So the conclusions that I bring today take a stance, but they're based on the neutral research that I've done before. If there is time, I would like to respond to an earlier point about prognosis prediction in psychiatry, because I'm afraid I disagree.
Excusez-moi, j'ai pas beaucoup de temps.
I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time. That was my first question. You've read the panel's report that seems to make a number of recommendations that include some precautionary principles, and where we can see that in a time of crisis, evaluators will not be able to receive all the information. So people that have mental disorders might not be adequately analyzed in a time of crisis, and then and in any situation, this situation is a concern. There must be 3 complementary points of view and take into account the capacity of the individual and for someone who is refusing care, and also they propose other interventions that might address the individual's concerns. So it's clear that within this report, we can make a distinction between persons who are contemplating suicide and where we see that there's the issue of coherence. And when I read that the evaluator must ensure that the desire to die is coherent and during a period of stability, not a time of crisis, and something that happens over time, and there are people that might say that it's almost impossible to even for physical problems, it would be impossible to get a clear or definitive evaluation.
Microphone, please.
Yes. To the point about prognosis, my research has shown my co-authors and I extensively looked at the question of prognosis prediction in psychiatry, looking at treatment-resistant depression as a paradigm case, looking both at clinicians' predictions and precision medicine. And the conclusion is that we cannot predict prognosis. Contrary to what Dr. True was saying, the state of the art of science says that even when we use precision medicine, the best prognosis prediction on the long term is at chance level. So that is what the science says, and that is what has been published on this topic. To the point about suicidality and autonomy that you're raising, I want to say this. Even if we agree, and we can agree, that some cases of persons with mental illness who have a wish to die warrant our compassion and assistance, we need to reckon with the fact that other cases of persons with a mental illness who want to die will warrant suicide prevention. No one believes that AMAD should replace suicide prevention. And so the problem is we don't have parameters to decide when to accept and when to reject patient autonomy on this. It's helpful to clarify that when we talk about autonomy, and if we want to be serious about autonomy, we talk about informed consent. The trouble is that many cases of patients who today receive suicide prevention meet the requirements for informed consent. And so if we want to be serious about patient autonomy, and if we want to legalize MAID for mental disorders, we first need to have a major overhaul of the way we do suicide prevention.
Thank you very much. And we now go to Mr. McGregor for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us today. Dr. Nicolini, I'd like to start with you. I was taking notes during your opening statement and your remarks on the difficulties with establishing incurability, irremediability, also the need for guidelines for suicide prevention, et cetera. And I think no one would disagree with you on that. With the way our criminal code is currently written, if you look at medical assistance in dying, what the definition of a grievous and irremediable medical condition is, it does mention that it has to be a serious and incurable illness. It also does mention it has to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline. But the section C also mentions that the condition has to be intolerable and also that it cannot be relieved under conditions that they consider acceptable. So there might be some potential conflict between those sections because you may hypothetically come up with a treatment, but if the patient finds that that treatment is not an acceptable one, they don't believe that that treatment is acceptable to them, that can relieve their conditions properly. Just do you have some thoughts? I mean, I'm probably asking you the same question in a different form, but if you can expand on that apparent conflict.
So your microphone, Dr. Nicolini.
Apologies. So another way of saying, okay, I heard an echo. Another way of saying what I've said before is that what's peculiar about mental disorders is that the staging models that we have do not correlate with prognosis, right? So when we talk about something incurable or irreversible, what we know is that someone can rate very high on that staging model, and that in no way correlates with long-term prognosis. So that is another way to say, to speak to the prognosis question. Of course, it's not just a matter of prognosis and uncertainty, as I've said before. It's a matter of having adequate standards for what we call an incurable mental disorder. So that is a whole different kind of issue that we have in mental disorders that we do not have in physical disorders. We do know, for example, what end-stage diabetes, what the standards for end-stage diabetes are. We may not know if someone, for sure, there might be uncertainty about prognosis, but we do have those standards about what we define as end-stage diabetes. We do not have that for mental disorders.
Mr. Rahim, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. I appreciate your opening remarks, particularly on Section 15 of the Charter, that everyone is deserving of equal protection and benefit of the law. You've heard the conversation so far in this panel. You're well aware of the expert panel report that we have each read. If you look at the job that we as parliamentarians have on this committee and the recommendations we're going to be making to the federal government, is there anything in particular you would like to see included in that report, particularly with this thematic area of mental disorders as a sole underlying medical condition? I know the expert panel felt that existing guardrails in the criminal code were adequate and that it was up to practitioners and the provinces and medical associations to develop these standards. But anything that you think the federal government has not yet addressed appropriately in this area that you think this committee should be recommending?
Well, one thing that certainly comes across to me and has in some of the prior panel's proceedings is, the distinction between some terms that are in the code being legal language versus medical language, and how that affects the clarity of understanding what those terms mean and what they entail. And certainly as a court or a lawyer, you're faced with, a set of facts, a decision that has been made according to a particular legal standard, and trying to determine whether those facts fit into that standard. And so what I would take away from this discussion and the panel's deliberations are the importance of this committee recommending that there be, as much as possible, clarity and specificity in whatever is developed, whether at the provincial level or by regulatory bodies, with respect to standards like what constitutes something that is incurable or irreversible, or what have you. And certainly I think the expert panel's report goes a long way in terms of setting that foundation. But in my view, the deliberations here and in other committee meetings have illustrated that it's necessary to go further, if only to ensure that when courts are faced with actually trying to apply these legal standards to a particular set of facts and a particular approach taken by medical professionals, that they also have some tools before them to assess that and aren't left in a situation de novo where they're trying to answer those questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rahim. I'm going to turn this over now to my co-chair for questions from the senators.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Nous allons maintenant aller aux questions des...
We will now turn to questions from the senators, and we'll begin with Senator Meiji. 3 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. My question is to Dr. Nicolini. You said earlier that prognostic is based on probabilities, and we have other experts here who have said that patients, a small proportion, have been ill for a number of years, undergone many treatments, and most of the treatments have not worked. And what is your response in this kind of situation for such patients? Do you think that they could meet the criteria for medical assistance in dying?
So this goes to my point earlier that I agree that a number of patients will have, and in fact, many patients will have a long history of prior psychiatric treatment. The question for individual MAID assessors is to know whether they truly will not recover, right? That is what it means to meet the irremediability requirement. When we looked at the evidence in the literature and about the trials that have looked at particularly this question, trials have started with a set of patients who all meet those requirements of serious disease at onset. And again, as I said earlier, that in no way correlated with their prognosis. So a majority of these cases actually got better, and a significant minority actually did not, right? So that is true. The question is, how can we be sure, right? What kind of prognosis certainty do we have? And as I said earlier, as things stand, we are close to chance level.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I think we spoke earlier. Sorry, I'm trying to find the page in my notes. With regard to basic constitutional rights. So for persons with only a mental disorder, under Article 15 of the Charter, how they would enter into this category? And how could we put something in our report to help them? Mr. Rahim, I believe.
If the report included some specific consideration of the application of Section 15 to the group of people who are seeking medically assistance in dying just on the basis of mental disorder, and discussed, for example, drawing from some of the Section 15 case law, such as the case in G, why an approach that either categorically excluded those who are living with mental disorder or applied a significantly more onerous regime upon them raises equality concerns, that could go some way. And as I say, in my view, for the reasons I outlined in my remarks, I think that the expert panel's report has inherently incorporated those considerations in the way that it has gone about thinking about the issue. I know the panel report itself does not go into detail about how its recommendations conform to Section 15, but when you see things like the role of individualized assessment, when you see the elaboration as to why the concerns raised are relevant for people with all medical conditions, not just those with mental disorder, those are hallmarks of an approach that is ensuring that those with mental disorder are not stereotyped. It's a hallmark of an approach that's taking into consideration that categorical treatment that does not account for individual variance and difference in a group can ground in part a Section 15 violation. So I think emphasizing those points would go some way to that.
Thank you, Mr. Rahim. We'll now go to Senator Kutcher for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for helping us with this study. Very, very much appreciated. My first question is for Mr. Rahim. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation, and also I appreciated you sharing with us that you are an individual who suffers from a mental disorder, and that gives you a perspective that many others may not have. In the study of logic, there is something called an ecological fallacy, which is defined as the situation of an individual who is a member of a group can be deduced by the criteria shared by the group they belong to. And thus, decisions made on the basis of group membership are fraught with challenge and problems. And so a case-by-case basis is the way to deal with that ecological fallacy. Do I understand you correctly that in Canadian jurisprudence, the courts have directed us to address MAID on a case-by-case basis?
I would not go as far as to say that the court has created a direction specific to MAID that states that a legislative approach when it comes to mental disorder or any other condition must be on a case-by-case basis. What I would say, however, is that the Section 15 jurisprudence recognizes that forms of treatment on an enumerated ground that are strictly categorical, so that, say, for instance, that all members of a particular group must be treated in this way because they have this characteristic or are at risk for particular vulnerabilities, may not pass constitutional muster. So if we go back to my comments about the Oakes test and when a violation of Section 15.1 can be justified, there have been many cases that have recognized that a minimally impairing alternative, so an alternative to saying one group has to be treated in this particular fashion, is that individualized assessment or a case-by-case assessment.
And the importance being the case-by-case assessment, from what I understand you said. So, Dr. True, I just wonder if you would clarify for me, I'm a bit confused. We heard that the Canadian perspective on a patient decision on irremediability is patient-driven and subjective. I wonder, you as a practicing psychiatrist, MAID provider, would you share that that perspective or that characterization that in Canada it's the patient that makes decisions about remediability? Or would you share the perspective that I think the panel talked about, that decision-making should be shared between physician and patient, and it's the combination of sharing between physician and patients that's the key issue here?
Very briefly, Dr. True.
Thank you. I think that I like the wording of the expert panel for sharing, and I think that is a bit of a shift from how most people read C14.
Thank you, Dr. True. Sénateur Dalphond, vous avez 3 minutes.
Senator Dalphond, 3 minutes. Senator Dalphond, you have 3 minutes.
Sénateur, on vous
Senator, we can't hear you. Go ahead. Can you hear me now? Yes. Sorry. So my question is for Mr. Rahim.
The Supreme Court said that the case was going too far by a blanket exclusions and required some case-by-case analysis, at least to meet the test of Hogue, that there be a safety valve to an extent. And the majority stated, I quote, individual assessments doesn't need to perfectly predict risk. Certainty cannot be the standard. End of quote. Does that mean that some unpredictability with mental disorders, as with any other illnesses, does not invalidate, in the court's view, the perspective of a case-by-case analysis?
In my view, so for example, in some of the Section 15 jurisprudence that concerns when an infringement can be justified and what a less minimally infringing measure could be, the court has emphasized that the alternative need not be perfect, right? That looking for certainty when trying to establish what an alternative could be that does not contravene 15.1 is not the test. And so to the extent that that would be responsive to your question, Senator, I would agree that that is not how an alternative that's less minimally impairing is evaluated. It is not a standard of perfection. That would be my answer.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Nicolini. Doctor, I understand you did not perform, but you've studied assessments that could lead to MAID, but you have reviewed a lot of literatures and research. You said that 1 to 2% of the cases of MAID that are administered are related to mental illness, so this is a small percentage. Do you have numbers about how many requests were granted, the percentage of requests that are granted, and how many of those that were granted proceeded to completion?
So I just want to clarify that I have not just reviewed the literature. I've actually studied the Dutch cases, large sample of Dutch cases where we looked at patient characteristics, their evaluations, how the requirements were applied, and so on. The Netherlands is the only country, as I'm sure you're aware, that publishes patient-level case reports, and they publish the cases that have been already performed, so people who have already died. So that means that we cannot compare those who have died versus those who have been requested but denied.
So you have no data about how many requested were granted, how many requests were granted, and of those that were granted, how many decide to proceed at the end? So these are
not data that are published by the Dutch government.
Okay, so you have no idea about these things. So you cannot say if there's a high level of people proceedings or a low level of people proceeding.
We can say based on the data of the end-of-life clinic, the expertise center euthanasia, but that is not what the government publishes.
Thank you.
And in fact, it's a characteristic of the practice that we do not know, as a matter of practice, how many get granted and how many get denied.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Senator Wallin for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to hear from Dr. True and Mr. Rahim just in response to a comment by Dr. Nicolini that we really don't have enough clarity on what the end stage of mental illness is, as we would in diabetes or cancer. I'm not 100% sure I agree with that. I'm thinking the end stage for far too many people is suicide. But I'd like the comparison to be clear. If you have a cancer diagnosis and you don't want any more treatment, yes, it's possible a miracle might come along, a miracle cure, but you're choosing to say, no, I don't want that option. I know I don't want to live like this. So why is it not the same then if treatment is not acceptable to you with a mental disability, that you've taken treatment, but you don't want to wait for some miracle cure that might come along? Are those two situations not roughly the same? Dr. True, if you would begin, and then from Mr. Rahim.
A couple things crossed my mind. One is that the statistics on death by suicide do not overlap terribly well with the statistics on on chronic mental disorder.
Okay.
So you peak. The men are 3 times as likely to die by suicide, whereas women are twice as likely to suffer from psychiatric illness. As an example, there's a difference in the shape of the curve as well in terms of age. So I would very much agree with Dr. Nicolini that we need to work on our strategy for dealing with suicidality. That there's still a lot of work to be done there. I may have lost track.
Yeah, I'm just trying to compare the someone with a mental disability saying, I don't, I'm at the end. I'm not waiting for the miracle, which the cancer patient might do as well.
Sure. I think then the issue really does come down to, well, how much is enough treatment? And if you've got somebody who's had really very little treatment from the perspective of an expert of treatment that has a decent chance of making a difference, then we get really uncomfortable. And yet then if we're saying, but they have the right to say, well, I'm not willing to try my 3rd drug, what do we do? Yeah, so that's I think the dilemma with because it looks like, from our perspective, that right to refuse is sort of absolute as far as.
Okay. Do we have time for a quick comment from Mr. Rahim?
I'm afraid it'll have to be very, very quick. Okay. Very quick, Mr. Rahim.
I would only say, Senator, that, I think this underscores that what is incurable or grievous and irremediable is going to be subject to different interpretations. And so when we think of incurability, and I'm thinking about the application of that as some kind of standard with respect to cancer, and now we look at what has been proposed by the panel, I think this is precisely the type of clarity that the committee can bring in terms of what has to be developed to ensure that practitioners have the necessary information to make those conclusions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rahim. We'll finish off with Senator Martin, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. My first questions are for Dr. Nicolini. We've been talking about the differences between someone in track 2 with physical illness or mental disorder and the difference. So the expert panel on MAID and mental illness concluded that its recommendations can be fulfilled without adding any new legislative safeguards to the criminal code. So Dr. Nicolini, do you agree that no additional criminal code safeguards are required in the case of MAID where the sole underlying condition is a mental disorder? Why or why not?
I think, so I would say I disagree for the reason that I've said before, that we need to recognize we need different standards. We need standards in the case of mental disorders. We all agree that mental health is a distinct discipline. That's how we treat it in practice. And the distinction is important because we see that when we simply port the standards or the requirements for MAID for mental illness to mental disorders, we end up with a patchwork of safeguards, as we have in Belgium and the Netherlands, that do not truly capture the goals of MAID for mental disorders, or the safeguards that we all think are important. So the point is that the discussion about adequate safeguards can only start when we're clear about what the adequate standards are.
There are specific safeguards that we should be looking at. Any safeguards that you wanted to mention at this time? If not, with time, I have one quick question for Mr. Rahim.
I just want to say it's no substitute for the standards. The safeguards are no substitute for standards. So we first need to be clear on what the standards are before we can discuss about the adequate safeguards.
Yes, thank you for that. And Mr. Rahim, would it be a Section 15 violation if the law prohibits MAID, MD-SUMC because irremediability can't be determined based on scientific evidence and not based on stereotyping or discrimination?
Stereotyping is not a necessary component of a Section 15 violation. Discrimination is defined as any imposition of a burden or denial of a benefit that reinforces, perpetuates, or exacerbates disadvantage. So that is the test. Whether that prima facie violation of Section 15.1 is then justifiable because there's some type of rationale. So, for example, the protection of people with mental disorder, that work is then done at the Section 1 component of the test, and that's the Oakes test.
Scientific evidence, if that's the basis.
Sorry, if you asked a question, I didn't get the full question.
I think am I out of time, Chair?
I'm afraid you are,
Okay.
Senator. So thank you very much, Senator Martin. And back to you, Senator Martin.
Once again, to our panelists, you have given us much food for thought, and your expertise was very helpful. So we're going to just suspend for a few minutes as we get the second panelist ready. Thank you very much. A quick few comments for our new panelists that have joined us. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the joint chairs. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. An interpretation in this video conference will work like an in-person committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And when you are not speaking, please kindly keep your microphone on mute. Okay, we have as our witnesses, as an individual, Mr. Mark Hennick, mental health advocate by video conference, Dr. Eric Keller, consultant liaison psychiatrist at Cork University Hospital, and de l'Ordre des Physicologues du Québec, Dr. Christine Groux, president and psychologist, and lastly, Dr. Isabelle Marleau, psychologist and director, quality and development of the practice. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have our first presenter, Mr. Mark Hennick. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this time to express myself on such a vital matter. You know, first and I think most importantly, what I'd like to say is that I'm come here as a person with lived expertise of a once treatment-resistant, long-term major depressive disorder, comorbid with social anxiety disorder, and a history of multiple escalating suicide attempts and inpatient hospitalizations. For years, I was prescribed cocktails of medications. I was restrained, isolated, and written off as hopeless. Yet, if not for who I was then, I wouldn't be who I am right now. And at long last, I finally actually enjoy the freedom of loving myself for who I am right now. Ever since those dark decades, I've pursued an advanced education, have worked as a mental health counselor, participated in some of the biggest mental health initiatives in the country, and I've toured every province and territory in Canada to talk with survivors and their families about mental health and mental illness. It's based on this experience, both professional and personal, that I vigorously oppose the expansion of medical assistance in dying solely for the reason of a mental illness. I can say without reservation that had MAID been available for mental illness and accessible to mature minors at the time, then today I'd be dead. And that wouldn't have been the only time in my life in which I would have considered it. I struggled with my mental health at times severely for more than 20 years. And yet today, I'm not dead. Today, I'm actually better. But I'm not exceptional. Recovery is routine. We're resilient by nature, and it takes active oppression to keep us down. Unfortunately, oppression is pervasive. Recovery ought not to be a privilege afforded to the few who can afford it. Recovery is a right. I'm evidence of what's possible when certain freedoms, choices, and means are indeed justifiably restricted. I think that this legislation has arisen from a dangerous reductionism. For example, mental illnesses and physical illnesses, which we heard about earlier, they're not collapsible into one another. The elimination of this difference has been a misguided attempt to elevate the esteem of mental health through attaching it to the greater perceived esteem of more worthy physical health issues. This, of course, perpetuates stigma. Mental health is worthy of independent esteem just as it is. The framing of mental illnesses as irremediable brain diseases is both unhelpful and largely untrue. Continually banging the drum of biological determinism, telling people that their brain is broken and irreparable, is not based in scientific consensus. This too perpetuates stigma. Irremediability of mental illnesses cannot be reliably predicted. Any clinician who tells you otherwise, in my opinion, is simply not a very good clinician. If you've tried 4 medications without success and then you feel that nothing works and that you've tried everything, you haven't. You've tried one thing. Professional silos exhaust and kill people, and they too perpetuate stigma. When allowing assessors to decide if someone with a mental illness is a hopeless case, you really need to ask yourself, how many times are you willing to be wrong? How many wrongful deaths are acceptable? The absence of evidence for hope is not evidence for absence of hope. If this legislation were actually about rights, it would more thoughtfully consider the decision pathway or the choice architecture that leads people with mental illnesses to want to die in the first place, whether through MAID or any other means. And if you walk that path, you'd see that MAID for mental illness alone is actually indistinguishable from suicide. How can we make a free choice if we think we have no other choices available? This is what it's like inside the mind of somebody who's considering suicide. I would know. Thanks to our natural availability bias, exacerbated by the cognitive rigidity imposed by our mental duress, and cultivated by the lacking salience of accessible treatment options, we falsely conclude that we will never get better, that there's no hope, and that we have no other choice. But it doesn't have to be this way. Recovery from mental illnesses is not only possible, it's indeed expected and likely, especially when people access care early. But every single province in this country is failing to meet its obligations under the Canada Health Act with respect to the delivery of mental health care. Until access to medically necessary psychotherapy is universal, and as long as wait times for psychiatry and other interventions can exceed a year or more, then mental health care in this country is neither accessible nor comprehensive. MAID for mental illness alone essentially asserts that if people with a mental illness think they want to kill themselves, then we should let them and even help them to do so. To call this assisted dying is to sanitize the reality. This is assisted suicide, and that is in direct opposition to suicide prevention efforts. MAID for mental illness alone is the ultimate indignity. It is worse than a violation of the rights of people with mental illnesses. It's robbing them of the opportunity to have their superseding rights restored and defended. In the spirit of the law of this land and in the moral law of our hearts, mental health care is a right. And suicide is not a crime. Suicide is a public health emergency maintained by a failing healthcare system. Don't pin that on the victims. Don't gaslight us into thinking that this is about our rights or our biological constitution or a romanticized ideal of a good death, one that happens to be conveniently cheaper on the public purse than investing in real care. The expansion of MAID to mental illness disincentivizes the repair of a broken system. So please refocus your energy instead on building a system that helps people to thrive, not to die. Every Canadian with a mental illness has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, whether that's by illness or systemic failings. So to that end, I ask you to fight for our charter right to live and stop the expansion of MAID for mental illness alone. Thank you for your attention today.
And next we will have Dr. Eric Keller for 5 minutes, Doctor.
Thank you. And I hope you can hear me. I just begin by saying I absolutely echo and support everything my colleague, Mr. Hennick, has just said. My name is Dr. Eric Kelleher. I'm a consultant liaison psychiatrist working at Cork University Hospital, Ireland, and an honorary clinical senior lecturer at University College Cork. I'm a member of the faculty, I'm a member of the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, where I'm vice chair of the Faculty of Liaison Psychiatry and a member of the Human Rights and Ethics Committee. I'm also co-author of our college's position paper on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, in which we oppose legislation to allow physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia in Ireland. And one of our greatest concerns about this type of legislation is that such laws will be extended over time to include patients with mental illness, the position many patients with mental illness in Canada are now facing. I'm speaking to you tonight, though, in a personal capacity, and I thank the committee for their kind invitation. I will summarize my opinion to 3 points. My first is that in enacting this legislation, the Canadian government is sending a very clear message to patients with mental illness that not only is it acceptable to end your own life, but that the government will in fact help you to do so. This will forever damage not only the relationship that exists between mental health professionals and their patients, but also how patients see themselves and their illnesses. Being suicidal is a core part of diagnostic criteria for depression, some psychotic illnesses, and certain personality disorders, all mental disorders that are eminently treatable with multidisciplinary team care. Proponents of this legislation will tell you that there are distinct differences between a person who has a depressive illness who is suicidal and a person who has a depressive illness who is choosing MAID, when in reality, it will be impossible for clinicians and our assessors to distinguish between the two. Mental illness, if any of you have been unlucky to experience this, does alter your view of yourself, your world, and your future. The illnesses themselves generate hopelessness, lethargy, avoidance, non-compliance with treatment by their very nature. The integral part of what psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals do is to identify and treat mental illness, restore hope, and support the patient at some of the most difficult times of their life. How can mental health professionals and Canadian suicide prevention strategists say to patients with mental illness that we encourage you not to end your life when MAID and mental illness will allow you to do so? And this brings me on to my second point. It is the duty of the Canadian government and the government in Ireland, or indeed anywhere in the world, to protect its most vulnerable citizens and ensure that legislation does not cause harm. Those who develop mental illness, such as depression and suicidal thoughts, are more likely to be poor, uneducated, disenfranchised, and experience childhood trauma, including sexual abuse. In the Netherlands, 60% of patients who received euthanasia were described as lonely and socially isolated. Research shows that women are more likely to experience clinical depression and experience abuse, and are also more likely than men to access
Dr.
MAID for
Keller?
mental illness.
Sorry
Yes?
for the interruption. Would you slow down the rest of your presentation? Thank you very much.
No
We have
problem.
translation in both languages, so thank you very much.
Of course, no problem. So rather than enabling patients to end their lives through assisted suicide, rather governments should consider how much funding there is for mental illness, how long are waiting lists to see a psychiatrist, and how government can provide excellent multidisciplinary team care to such patients. For only then can patients truly be said to have a choice about their treatment. And this brings me on to my third point. The management of mental illness involves seeing the patient as a whole person and exploring all aspects of their presentation and their care, psychological, social, and biological factors. There is no evidence that mental illness treatment is irremediable. In practice, improving some or indeed all of their biological, social, and psychological factors may need to be optimized for a patient to see an improvement. Do you consider a patient who is suicidal and suffering from a clinical depression associated with significant loneliness and poverty to be irremediable? Of course not, but many of these factors, such as poverty and housing, may take months to address adequately, by which time they may have already died from MAID in mental illness if provided. I was shocked to read how a patient in Canada with multiple chemical sensitivities was provided with MAID because they could not cope living with their illness in housing that did not meet their healthcare needs, despite looking for such housing from official agencies for 2 years. Surely there is something profoundly wrong about this woman's treatment, that she could secure death from government-funded agencies, but not housing. So in summary, disclosing difficult and frightening thoughts such as suicide needs to not only be met with empathy, but with practicality, and working with the patient to find solutions, not to superficially endorse their dangerous and life-threatening cognitive distortions of mental illness, and enable patients with mental illness, who are some of society's most vulnerable, to end their own lives in providing MAID for mental illness. I sincerely thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Grew and Dr. Marleau, are you both speaking, or is one of you representing? Okay, so I assume that Dr. Grew will speak. Thank you very much. So you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the committee for inviting the Order of Psychologists of Quebec to make a presentation. And I am president of the order, and I am a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychologist specialized in mental health. I've worked in this field for 35 years. I've treated people in this field, and I have developed a great deal of expertise in severe mental disorders, and I am also president of the Hospital Ethics Committee and have been for more than 10 years. And Dr. Marleau is a specialist in neural development problems and has a role as a clinical psychologist as well. The issue of MAID is focused for the order for a number of years. for individuals having a mental disorder, especially since this is our field of expertise. And I would like to say that the order is in agreement with most of the recommendations, all the recommendations made by the expert panel. And I'd like to say that we believe in the usefulness of treatment. We want to treat people, and we ensure that there are quality psychological services, and we believe strongly in treatment and in accessibility for a person suffering from a mental disorder. As the expert group has made a number of recommendations, and we agree with them, and are based on medical literature. We believe that there is no need for any additional criterias or guideposts for persons having a mental disorder. And most individuals who currently request MAID for a physical condition, may be doing so not because of their physical suffering, which has not been alleviated, but because of their psychological suffering. And they have the right to make such a medical request. And why have different rules for persons who are simply have a mental disorder? And we believe that the current evaluation process is sufficient to evaluate persons who are taking a decision, an informed decision. And the challenge is, of course, to ensure that it is an irreversible mental disorder and that their suffering is continuing and untreatable. And this current system allows to avoid having persons who are simply requesting suicide because of a new situation. And we believe that the evaluation process will allow for respecting the right to decide by persons with a mental disorder while protecting vulnerable persons, whether they are vulnerable because of their social or health situation. And with regard to AMM, we believe that psychologists should be called on to participate, given their specific expertise, and this will allow them to make an important contribution to the analysis, and they should be called on to participate in the evaluation, and they might be the most relevant experts to call on. And we, of course, have undergone many years of study. We have doctorates, and they are particularly aware of the issues of confidence, and we are trained in internalizing and not applying our own prejudices, but rather respecting the wants and needs of the individual. And up till now, there are excellent processes in place for MAID. And we also believe that given the existing system, only a small number of individuals would be eligible for MAID, because of the existing safeguards, and that would be adequate protection. And we also believe that we have to take this next step, and we've taken a long time to recognize the right to decide by people who have mental disorders. And we also took a lot of time to understand that there's not two sides, physical and mental, and the two are linked. And we now should recognize the rights of people with mental disorders, and they should not be denied a right that is given to other patients. And we have to ensure that there is access to such services for these individuals. and to ensure that they have received all the care possible before taking the step towards MAID. Thank you very much.
Panelists and for your testimony today. We're going to go into our first questioners, and Madame Vien and Mr. Cooper will share their 5 minutes. So we'll begin with Madame Vien.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Alors, on va aller rapide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gru. I read your presentation. It was very interesting. And with regard to recommendations set 7 and the fact that there must be adequate treatment before the step towards medically assisted dying. What would you say to people who refuse treatment and want to go right to the step of death? I think what we have to underscore is that the mental disorder aspect, and we want consent to be freely given, and if we want consent to be freely made, we have to ensure that the treatment proposed in the first place, there must be an explanation of alternatives, and we have to respect the informed choice by the patient. So if the patient is independent enough to understand the information, understand the options, we have to understand and accept their choice. Conclude quickly, if you want. Well, so if we respect the informed choice made by the individual, we can't force them to follow all these different types of treatment, because that means we're not really respecting their choice. But in order to have access to other therapies, and in an area like mine, a rural area, where there's no or little possibility for such things, what should the government do? Well, I think that the request for MAID must not be the result of a failure by the health system. This is something where you propose different health interventions, and you can see the patient's health history, treatment history. And it's true that it's difficult to make a prognosis, and when there's an individual has a long history of treatments or problems, and we have to have access to services, because we have to develop access to services and available services while still allowing access to MAID. Mr. Cooper.
Madam Co-Chair, Dr. Kelleher, some witnesses have warned this committee about suicide contagion, noting that in countries that allow MAID for mental illness, suicide rates have increased. Other witnesses have disputed those claims. Based upon your research, what happens to suicide rates in countries that allow MAID for mental disorders?
So it's a really, really good question. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of information out there. There has been a recent systematic review, which is the highest or one of the highest forms of evidence published this year, which said just that there isn't an awful lot of research in this field. But several studies do actually report increases in the overall rates of self-initiated death, and in some cases, increases in non-assisted suicide in countries that have brought in MAID type procedures. In particular, with women in some of the Benelux countries, they're increasingly accessing MAID for mental illness, and that's a pattern that typically women who engage in self-harm choose non-lethal methods to do so. But there's been a rising number of women with psychiatric illness dying from MAID provision in mental illness, which is in contrast to what we see in men. So certainly some of the trends from Europe are that MAID for mental illness seems to disproportionately affect women. And in some countries, it does appear to also have a contagion effect in also increasing the non-assisted suicide rate. And that's something we see in suicide rate in suicide research. Anyway, there's often a contagion effect when there is suicides locally, and that's why we have very strict media guidelines and reporting about suicide and how it is portrayed in the media.
Thank you. And Dr. Kelleher, could you provide the studies that you have referenced to the committee?
Yeah, I can absolutely. They're both published earlier this year. One is by David Jones, who's in the UK, and the other by Professor Anne Doherty, who's in Dublin. So I can send you those references, yes.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to have Monsieur Arsenault for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, Mr. Hinnick, thank you for sharing your own personal experience with us and for sharing your experience with mental illness and with regard to your fight against this disorder. You did you have anything with regard to medically assisted death? And did you have any experience or rejection of that? I don't know if the witness is still there. Mr. Hennick. Non, j'ai demandé l'aide médicalement. So you never requested MAID. I thought I heard in your testimony that you were someone who would have probably received MAID.
Had it been available during the peak of my struggles, and in fact throughout the duration of my chronic mental illness, there were many times where I would have applied.
Sorry, I don't have a lot of time. But you never made a request for it, and you never consulted anyone to make a request for MAID?
No, it wasn't available.
Thank you very much. Ms. Grou, Dr. Grou, to sum up what you said, and you agree with the recommendations from the expert panel, and we talk a lot about irremediability, and what can you say with regard to irremediability and the expert panel? I think that the prognosis of irremediability, it's true, it's complicated in mental health, also with physical health, of course. But in complex situations, we have to maybe develop better criteria. Sorry, can you give us some examples? In my life as a psychiatrist, there were two people who might have requested MAID. This is not something that is very common. It's not something that we can have in a context of long servants. But even if over 10, 15 years you haven't received care that allowed you to continue, I think there's, I think you have to understand that there are situations which are very difficult with a severe, complex mental disorders. That's very rare, but it does exist. And so if I say that there is someone who has a cancer that can be treated? Are they going to be condemned to continue to suffer? Or are you going to deny them the possibility of putting an end to their suffering? And I think that the desire to die, despite everything that has been tried, it's not something that we're going to abandon or that the health system should abandon. And when we look at the various treatments and over a long period of time, when the person continues to suffer, especially over a long period of time, and given all the aspects to their problem, their suffering, and the effect on the family and their friends who have seen them suffering for years. Next quick question for Dr. Eric Keller. Have you, what is your reaction to the Carter decision, in which the court said that under Article 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights regarding to right to life and security of the person? How do you reconcile that with the Charter?
Sorry, can you clarify the question, please? I didn't hear the first part, please.
Apologies, we've run out of time on this one. So
Merci à chaque témoin.
We'll move to the next questioner, Monsieur Thériault.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hennick, I'm asking you this question because you spoke of your personal experience. You've also heard Dr. Drew. If you've read the experts' report, why do you think that you would have been a possible candidate for MAID when you were ill? So why do you think that you would have been a candidate who would have been accepted for MAID at that time?
Thank you for that question and for the opportunity to follow up on that. I'm convinced that I would have been an eligible candidate. I'd been in and out of hospital involuntarily more than half a dozen times. I'd been transferred to different hospitals. I was on locked wards. I was on more than a dozen different medications, and nothing really seemed to work. I'd talked to plenty of different doctors. It was chronic and persistent for enough years that I absolutely would have been a candidate. And should this continue to unfold, this legislation, toward allowing so-called mature minors, I would have probably qualified much earlier on. I am so grateful, so eternally grateful that MAID for mental illness was not available when I was struggling, because I was convinced that I wouldn't live to see another day, and I have. And I think everybody deserves that opportunity too. If you really look at the root causes why people are struggling for so long, it's not that the treatments don't work. We have lots of evidence to suggest that they do, that the real problem is access and getting connected to those treatments, which was exactly what I experienced.
Vous avez répondu à ma question, excusez-moi.
Thank you. You've answered my question. I don't have a lot of more time. I know that this is not a happy situation for you, but thank you for answering my question. I'd like to go to Dr. Grew. And you've read the report by the panel, and you support it? How can you say that there would be it would be negative for the prevention of suicide if we go towards MAID? With regard to prevention of suicide, this is something that we have to continue to work on by providing access to continuous help and care. That's essential, but we can't look at suicide patients as being all the same. And suicide could be something that's a spontaneous reaction to a situation. someone could be a lot better in a couple of weeks. And this is very different from someone who, for example, someone who has a physical problem, who has no quality of life and who becomes suicidal after reflecting on their situation and the impossibility of their situation. And what about someone who is a mental disorder and has been suffering intolerably for a long time? That person could rationally say that the quality of life is longer than continuing to live. And so if that person wants to die, is someone who might ask for MAID for a physical patient. And if we are dealing with someone who has had a long history of treatment, alternatives for treatment, things that have been proposed, things that nothing has worked, and this person wants to stop suffering and wants to die, and there we have two choices. And I can assure you that there are patients who will try and put an end to their days after having thought about it for a long time. And this is a situation that we have to provide them with a choice that is given to others so that they can have the possibility of making an informed decision, whether it's a physical or a mental problem. I think we have to respect the right to choose of every individual concerning treatment or not being treated or continuing treatment, and we have to have respect for everyone. We can't just exclude people because it's their mental trouble.
Okay. Mr. Hennick, I'd like to start with you. I appreciate you coming before our committee and sharing your personal story. Ultimately, what was the treatment that led to your success to where you are today? Was it? I'd like to know a little bit more about the medical professional that was involved to helping you with where you're today. Just a little bit about the treatment that made your personal story a successful one.
Sure. I wish I could tell you that it was something more eloquent than luck and time. Because the treatments that I received, some of them made me a lot worse. Is a well-known warning on prescribing antidepressants in particular to kids, particularly actually now if they're under 30, but especially if they're just teenagers, as I was. And I was on, as I said before, more than a dozen different antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti-anxiolytics, sleeping pills, hypnotics, and a number of others, anti-seizure medications prescribed off-label for various reasons. So, you know, in some ways, my treatment actually hindered my recovery. My inpatient hospitalizations were traumatic, what I experienced largely there. It was only after I was able to go off and go to college and get a better social support network to start getting into therapy. I never had access to psychotherapy in a meaningful way when I was in the acute valley of my struggle. It was only through that kind of social support, through time, and through doing something different with my life that I was able to see that I was capable of so much more than I had ever thought before.
I've got some limited time. I've got a few more questions with you today. So you did state that had medical assistance in dying for a mental disorder as a sole underlying medical condition, if it had been available, that you would have applied for it. But can you say with certainty, given the guardrails that exist in our criminal code, you know, you need those two independent medical practitioners. I mean, it seems to me it's a hypothetical here. Like you're saying with certainty that it would have been granted, but we can't truthfully know that for sure, can we?
Well, you can't, but you learn when you've been an inpatient in a hospital enough times what to tell doctors in order to get them to do what you need them to do. I was able to get out of hospital when I shouldn't have been. I was able to get into hospital maybe when I shouldn't have been. You know, you learn when you're a frequent flyer, as I was frequently called, you learn how the system works. And I saw that as a mental health professional as well. Patients do that all the time.
And to clarify, like for medical assistance in dying for people who are suffering from physical ailments that are causing them grievous and irremediable harm, that they're going through that suffering, are you in support of that for physical ailments?
Like well,
for someone who's got terminal cancer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. I don't have a blanket opposition to medical assistance in dying, no. I think that it's a false comparison between the two, however.
Well, yeah, and I just wanted to dig down onto that because, I mean, like we've had previous witnesses talk about, Section 15 rights, equality under the law, equality before the law. We know the way the Supreme Court has taken a view on these things. We're also, the fact of the matter is that the law has already been changed. Like we're looking at this after the fact. So, and I'm saying this with respect, just really it's a truthful question. Like, how do you reconcile your view with someone's Section 15 rights, right? What if there was someone who did have a mental disorder who had a completely polar opposite view to yours? Are you saying that your view should override their personal story, their subjective experience? I just truly want to dig down onto that, to your viewpoint on that.
I'm saying that the treatment pathway to each of those conditions is very different. Chances are somebody who has had end-stage cancer, as a previous witness has mentioned, has a much clearer picture that they are indeed irremediable, that they are indeed going to either die anyway or in the foreseeable future, even though that part is different now. They likely didn't experience the same kind and the same degree of stigma, of discrimination, of failure of social supports that somebody with a mental health problem or illness did. So just treating them equally in isolation, I can absolutely defend that because the contexts that lead people to that point are very different. There's also the added piece that mental illnesses, by definition, even if you don't lose decision-making capacity, inform the decisions that you make. And we can't ignore that context.
I will now turn this over to my co-chair, Monsieur Garneau. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Martin. We'll go to the senator round of questions for 3 minutes each. We'll have to stick to those 3 minutes. On va commencer avec la sénatrice.
We'll start with Senator Meji, 3 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. My question is for Dr. Grue. You said that you agree with the idea of not adding a new criteria for persons with a mental disorder, and you said that you can use the same criteria. Can you give an example of any abuse that might have occurred? And I'll ask a second question quickly. With regard to regulations, how can we help evaluators dealing with someone with a mental disorder? When I talk about new criteria, the idea is if the current criteria are correctly interpreted, that's the criterion. And there is a series of recommendations that can be made, but we have to take into account the experience of the patient in evaluating whether the situation is irreversible. With the patient, the family, the various treatments that have been tried, and the experience over time, the trajectory of their condition. And I think it's very important as well to identify the intensity and the continuity of their suffering. And we have to ensure that there is access to appropriate services for these persons. We know this is very difficult in different regions. So within these criteria and safeguards, we know that it's important to have access to specialists who can inform them about their condition, and also access to specialists who can offer treatment. And there also has to be a period of reflection, because consent is a process. And this process, with regard to in a mental health context, we have time. And I think if we look at all these various criteria and benchmarks, I think it's possible to evaluate their situation. And there's also the issue of, is their situation ongoing? Thank you very much, Dr. Groom. Now, Senator Kutcher.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for helping us in these challenging deliberations. My questions are for Dr. Kelleher, and there'll be 3 or 4 of them, but they're only require a very short answer. And you're here as a person with an expert opinions about MAID, and in your testimony you alluded to a case in Canada. So the first question is, are you qualified as a MAID assessor and provider in Canada or in any other country?
No, so in Ireland...
Right, that's great. That's fine.
Yeah.
The other thing is, how many MAID assessments have you participated in, or seen, or viewed, or sat in on?
So I work in Ireland. I don't work in...
Well, no, that's okay. I know where you work. Yeah, thanks.
So I haven't done any MAID assessments because I'm not qualified, and that's not something
Do you know what is the protocol for MAID used in Canada? Specifically, what medications are used, what doses, in what sequence, what the route of administration is?
So I have read on that, and I do understand some of the literature around that. Yes.
Can you tell me then what the doses are and what medications are used? And
I don't know what the doses are, but they're usually phenobarbital.
Do you know of any Canadian data on the process of MAID provision? What happens to a person in the process of receiving MAID? Are you familiar with that data?
So I have read the protocol, but I suppose my concerns about this.
So given all those things in your
just a point of order, Mr. Chair.
You state, quote, techniques used to bring about death can themselves result.
Point of order.
One moment, please. One moment, please, Senator Kutcher. Your point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if the practice at this committee is similar to other committees where witnesses are given equal amounts of time to answer as the questioner is to pose the question. I appreciate time is limited, but it's this is not typically a committee where we're able to give yes or no, or expert witnesses can give yes or no answers to questions.
I believe that's argumentative. No, there is no rule about equal time for questions and answers. There are specific questions, and in some cases, the questioner is allowed to move on to the next question. So please carry on, Senator Kutcher.
In your report, you write, quote, techniques used to bring about death can themselves result in considerable and protracted suffering. So can you tell us what information you are basing in the Canadian context that someone who is receiving MAID actually, because of MAID, will have considerable and protracted suffering?
So can I ask what exactly you're quoting from?
You're quoted from this document that was provided to us.
Okay, so techniques to bring about. So I'm so sorry, but what exactly are you quoting me from? I don't recognize what you've just held up there.
We all have a copy of this. The position paper on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia from the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, consultant liaison psychiatrist Dr. Ella Kelleher, speaking today, he said.
Yes, so what we are concerned about, what our college's position paper was that certainly in Ireland, again, this echoes other speakers who have spoken before. Access to palliative care is limited throughout the country. We do not have immediate access to things like hospice. The provision of palliative care, as I said, and certainly what I do as a lay psychiatrist, working conjointly with our colleagues in palliative care, providing mental care to patients with mental health care to patients with mental illness isn't easily available in different parts of the country. So certainly, having access to all treatment actually alleviates distress for somebody who has a terminal illness and who is dying. Is something that we believe as the college should be easily provided for. So that isn't something that is available, and that's what our concerns were there.
Thank you, Dr. Kelleher. We'll now go to Senator Dalphond.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Dr. Gros or Dr. Malo. And Dr. Michel, University of Quebec, Montreal, the director of research on suicide with regard to ethics, has made studies on the Netherlands, and he has concluded that the average evaluation of a person who wants to die, the period for evaluation was 10 months, fairly long time, and that 5% of the requests were granted. And in your professional opinion, and you say that you've only seen 2 cases in your experience where they would have been eligible according to the guidelines. And what is your reaction as a clinician and the president of the order? Do you agree that the Netherlands experience would be about the same in Canada? Well, I'm always I always find it difficult to give my opinion when I don't have a lot of information. But based on my experience, care and access means that most health problems can be treated even if they're complex or extended over time. And I've seen 2 cases in my experience where the individuals were determined to end their days because they were no longer able to continue living. And I think that in psychiatry, when we see the suffering of individuals, trauma, their struggle, there's the issue of their illness and the lack of resources and the social isolation. So there are cases where all of this is concentrated in one person, added to severe mental disorders. And there are other cases where people wanted to die, supposedly. But when we try to evaluate these cases, and I think when we have clinicians who are trained to treat, and it's difficult often, or can be difficult to treat someone when we have our own training and our belief that treatments will help, and there can be treatment. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to interrupt you.
Martin now. 3 minutes.
For appearing before our committee. My first question is for Mr. Hennick. Some witnesses have told this committee that excluding people who suffer solely from mental disorders is discrimination. As a person who advocates for this community, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that people with mental health problems and illnesses are already being discriminated against routinely. Our rights are routinely violated. And that's actually the problem. That's what's getting us to the point where we feel like we have no other option than to request MAID. So there have already been a long line of violations to the rights of people with mental illnesses that, in my view, supersede any further action in this regard.
And on a personal level, I just wanted to say your testimony was very compelling, and it does give all of us hope for what could the way that we can be looking at people with mental disorders. So thank you for your strength and courage. Dr. Kelleher, witnesses have provided conflicting testimony whether MAID can be entirely distinguished from suicide, and it's really important for us to have an answer to that question. Would you share your thoughts on that?
So often there is a suggestion that there are no differences between suicidal, or that there are differences between the patient who has a depressive illness and who's suicidal and one who's MAID. But in truth, in practice, there is very little difference to distinguish between those two things. Very little suicidal behavior, whether it's lethal or non-lethal, occurs without planning. In fact, impulsive attempts are associated with people who have possibly a lower psychopathology. Individuals who make planned attempts at suicide are more likely to be depressed and hopeless compared to those who make unplanned attempts. And the clinical profile, as my colleague, Dr. Nicolini, has highlighted earlier, appears to be similar in MAID and suicidal behavior, as evidenced by the high prevalence of women in both situations. So it's therefore unclear whether or not we can draw a firm distinction between MAID and suicidality, posing a major problem for the practice of MAID for mental disorders.
That concludes this second panel, and we are exactly on time. So again, thank you to all of our witnesses for helping us work through this very difficult topic and lending us your expertise. And colleagues, with that, I call this meeting to an end.